The twist: Mr. and Mrs. Beatrice were a couple admired by many. They were wealthy, well respected, and always attended social functions, looking happy. But behind the expensive clothes and radiant smile lay a deep sorrow, the pain of childlessness. For 27 years, they had tried every remedy, visited countless doctors, and sought spiritual solution, yet no child came. Their mansion felt empty despite its grandeur, and Mrs. Beatrice often cried herself to sleep. To ease her loneliness, she hired a living maid, Betty, a young girl who was hardworking and respectful. Mr. Beatrice treated Betty kindly, ensured she lacked nothing. One day, Mrs. Beatrice heard about a powerful pastor who held prayer session on a mountain. Desperate for a miracle, she packed her bag and traveled for the 3 days prayer retreat. On the last day, the pastor looked at her with intense eyes and prophesied, "Rejoice, woman, you shall conceive very soon." Excited Mrs. Beatrice returned home and shared the revelation with her husband. But Mr. Beatrice was not as thrilled. He had heard such words too many times before, only to be met with disappointment. That night, as they prepared for bed, gunshots suddenly shattered the silence of their luxurious home. Before they could react, armed robbers stormed into the house. "Get up! Now and lie down on the floor!" One of them barked. Trembling Mr. and Mrs. Beatrice obeyed, fear gripping them like a vice. The robbers demanded money and jewelry and other valuables. Mr. Beatrice gave them everything they asked for, but it wasn't enough. One of the robbers turned to Mrs. Beatrice with a sinister smile. Before she could scream, he dragged her to a corner and violated her. Mr. Beatrice watched helplessly, powerless to stop the horror unfolding before him. When the robbers finally left, they took their possession and shattered souls with them. Mrs. Beatrice sobbed uncontrollably, while Mr. Beatrice stood frozen, unable to console her. Their maid Betty had hidden in the pantry and was unharmed. Months passed, and one morning, Mrs. Beatrice woke up feeling unwell. She vomited several times before deciding to visit the hospital. When the doctor returned with her test results, she was stunned. "Madam, you are 3 months pregnant. Congratulations." Mrs. Beatrice stared at the doctor in disbelief. Could this be the prophecy coming true? But then, her mind flashed back to the night of the robbery. Doubts clouded her joy. She shared the news with her husband, who was overjoyed. He pampered her, ensuring she lacked nothing. However, the fear of the unknown haunted her. They decided that once the child was born, they would conduct a DNA test to confirm the paternity. Months later, Mrs. Beatrice gave birth to a beautiful baby girl through a cesarean section. The couple adored their child, but deep inside, a storm brewed. When the DNA test arrived, their worst fear was confirmed. The baby was not Mr. Beatrice. The revelation shattered him. It meant that he had been the one with the fertility issue all along. Mrs. Beatrice felt a strange mix of emotion. Vindicated because she had been blamed for their childlessness for years, yet devastated because her long-awaited child belonged to an unknown criminal. Despite everything, she decided to love her baby unconditionally. Weeks later, Betty started falling sick. Concerned Mrs. Beatrice took her to the hospital. The doctor's words struck like lightning. Betty was pregnant. Ha! shocked Mrs. Beatrice drove home in silence. Once inside, she demanded to know who was responsible. Betty fell to her knees, weeping. "Please, Ma, I'm sorry," she pleaded. "I said, who is responsible?" Mrs. Beatrice repeated. Betty sobbed harder before blurting out, "Ma, it is Oga." Mrs. Beatrice felt her entire world tilt. Ha! The room spun around as she processed Betty's confession. When Mr. Beatrice returned home that evening, he was met with cold stares. Mrs. Beatrice confronted him. "Is it true? Did you get Betty pregnant?" Yea, he lowered his head in shame. "I was broken after the DNA test. I felt worthless," he explained. "I didn't plan for this to happen, but Betty was there, and one thing led to another." Tears welled up in Mrs. Beatrice's eyes. Betrayal coursed through her veins. She had endured childlessness for 27 years, only to conceive by a rapist. And now, her husband, who had finally confirmed he was the problem, had impregnated their maid. Ha ha ha! She wept uncontrollably. What kind of twist is this? After all these years of waiting, my child belonged to a criminal, and my husband fathered a child with the maid, she cried. Mr. Beatrice knelt before her, begging for forgiveness, but his words felt hollow. The once happy home was now filled with bitterness, pain, and betrayal. Mrs. Beatrice realized that fate had played a cruel joke on her. Hope you enjoyed the stories. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.